you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. First of all, I'd like to thank Jason DaCosta. He took the time to put together a thorough response to my recent video. Ultimately, I feel like this has been a very productive exchange. My end goal was to motivate prominent Israel-only advocates like Jason DaCosta to pay closer attention to Dr. Staples' theory, and I'm really glad that DaCosta has stepped up to the plate to address the points that I brought up. I must say, I compliment first and critique as we go. Jason is a very, very smart man. I really like him. I repeat, if we were in person, I know we'd hang out. So without that issue being brought up, I'm not just saying this, even though I am saying this. I'm not just saying that. I really think he's a funny guy. The guy should really get into comedy. Just the character that he is just wonderful. I realize that DaCosta probably felt that I was personally critiquing him and that I was somehow attacking IO, but really I just wanted to correct the record on specific points where I thought he went wrong, and ultimately I think I accomplished that. And DaCosta seems to have admitted some of his mistakes with some reservation, at least with respect to Jason Staples. But I do feel like there are still a few more corrections to be made after his last 2 hour and 7 minute response on his YouTube channel. It seems like the best way to get DaCosta to engage with Staples' theory was to kind of channel Dr. Staples, so to speak. My initial video consisted of a 12-minute introduction where I offered some of my personal opinions, but the rest of the video consisted of nearly 40 minutes of quotations from Jason Staples. I was reading a document that was literally 9 pages of copied and pasted citations from his 2011 article. I did throw up a couple of images. I tried to summarize a few points, but I really made an effort to keep my own opinions and interpretations out of it as much as possible. But in DaCosta's recent response, he was clearly making this personal. Maybe I should have clarified that I don't necessarily agree with Jason Staples on every point he makes. I'm just trying to clarify what he's actually saying. I assume that DaCosta just skipped over a lot of this stuff. Obviously, he assumes that I'm fully on board with Staples, and he even speculates that I somehow secretly concede that Staples' work actually supports IO more than I'm letting on. But I think it's worth clarifying, I don't actually have a dog in the fight. I'm just trying to pit these opposing positions against each other to see what shakes out. I try to keep an open mind to a number of different theories, including full preterism and Israel only. DaCosta seems to think that I've completely closed my mind, but that's just not true. Here's an example which is actually kind of amusing around the 1 hour and 40 minute mark.
Warning, I was a Kool-Aid drinking Calvinist Christian who was obsessed with the Reformed faith.
And Derek has somehow gone away from this. But if you, actually, I'm going to let you in on a little secret here, and I hope Derek doesn't mind. But if you search Derek Lambert Salvation or something on YouTube, or here's one, Calvinism is True, Derek Lambert, you'll find Derek's old channel where he's got, I don't know, 150 subscribers or whatever. And he's got a bunch of videos when he was in the Christian movement. And you'll see a ton of them where he's talking about all not meaning all as in everyone. See, Derek was a huge Calvinist. If you look at some of these videos, Derek fights for Calvinism in them. I'm going to let you listen to a clip from one right here. Here's Derek about, I don't know, 8 years ago.
Okay, limited atonement, okay? For God so loved the world, or he is the propitiation for our sins, but not only ours, but for the whole world. Here's the thing. You have either Christ dies for everyone, and everyone is saved. Christ dies for everyone, but not everyone's saved, and he fails. And if he didn't fail, then you have to factor in man's doing. You have to.
All right, so that's Derek. You know, he's looking like Jebediah something on there, like he belongs on. I don't know, what was that old show? God, I can't even remember. But that's him talking. Let's see if we can catch a little bit more here.
Look it up. Watch debates. Get involved and don't let your emotions. You need to check. You need to fear God. You need to work out your salvation if you're in trembling, even though that's a sanctification. Brothers and sisters, this is why I'm a Calvinist.
Okay, so Derek was a Calvinist, all right? He was a fighter for the Calvinistic viewpoint because he understood what I talked about earlier, how Christ wouldn't even lose one. He understood that concept. He couldn't get around it. In fact, in the beginning of this video, he flashes on the screen the Acts 13 passage where it says, as many Gentiles that were appointed to eternal life believed. Because he's pushing the agenda, or the truth, I should say, that there's only a limited amount of people in view here in the salvation narrative. And he knew that back then, and he fought for it. He also has videos on here about how all doesn't mean all and all this stuff. So he had the right foundational principles, but ever since he's gone astray, Derek's a sheep led astray into these myth ideas. He's getting all balled up, and he's forgetting the core things that keep this story in check. So he had that all right. All right. But somehow he's forgotten that, and he's back on this universal thing, which doesn't even make sense.
While I was in the middle of reading quotations from Jason Staples that didn't include any of my own commentary, DaCosta felt compelled to pull up an old video of me 8 years ago, professing beliefs that I used to hold on to the doctrines of Calvinism. I honestly don't mind this at all. I'm not trying to hide anything. Those old videos are up there on that channel for a reason. I'm the one who put them there. So be my guest to use them and look at them, but that's there for a reason. I could literally shut that channel down if I wanted. It wouldn't be a problem at all if I wanted to do that. But I want you to see what fundamentalism really looks like. I mean, I must have done such a great job channeling Jason Staples that DaCosta got carried away with the role play and actually forgot that I was still reading Staples' article. He kept saying, guys like Derek and Staples. And he even thought I was quoting the Old Testament, saying, Derek's making much ado about nothing here. Derek? With Hosea 8:8, he says, he concluded that I've been led astray and that I'm back on this universal thing. But I'm not a universalist. I'm not even a Christian. I'm just reading someone else's article. That's it. I do actually think that some of the Calvinism stuff may be a better paradigm for interpreting most of the Bible than universalism. I just don't think that this is true in some ontological sense. Since I'm no longer a Christian, I don't claim to know exactly what every jot and tittle of the Bible means. I'm still trying to work a lot of this stuff out. My goal was not to provide my own exegesis of the Bible. I was just saving you and my audience the trouble of reading the blog post and article by reading the salient points out loud. Some people only have the bandwidth for this kind of video content. I get that. I'm a big fan of Audible. I listen to a lot of books, audio, and I watch YouTube videos to get a lot of my information sometimes. But I digress. Here's another point worth mentioning. Dr. Staples isn't even arguing against I.O., Israel only, directly. As far as I know, he doesn't even know what Israel only is. Most people don't have a clue about this theory. Staples is coming at these issues from a totally different perspective. Maybe it's never even occurred to him to interpret the term Gentiles in the New Testament as gentilized northern Israelites, but he does draw very similar conclusions as I.O. with regard to several passages in the New Testament, only without the assumption that the Roman Empire was full of actual northern Israelites. Thankfully, in the end, I do think DaCosta's walked away with a clearer understanding than what he expressed in the first casual video presentations driving around in his pickup truck. Because he made it clear he's not infallible or, doesn't make mistakes when he's in that pickup truck. But ultimately, he did end up sitting down at that infallible desk, the desk that helps him get the answers correct and correctly cite things, to give consideration it deserves, and I really do appreciate that. So here are the things that I'd like to clarify from DaCosta's last video, in order to make a few points and to continue setting the record straight regarding Jason Staples' theory. Jason Staples' theory, as I understand it. First of all, am I really the one making a fuss over Jason Staples? I actually heard it first about Jason Staples on Facebook, when his article started getting posted on various I.O. groups on Facebook last year. Check out this article right here that's posted by Michael Bierus, one of the top 3 leading proponents of the Covenant Israel Only theory. The Black Sheep group on Facebook. Feel free to join to check out some controversial stuff about Israel Only. If you're on Facebook, you can check it out. So back in 2019, of November the 15th, Michael Bierus, so to give you a little inside scoop, Michael Bierus Michael Bradley and Jason DaCosta are the top 3 guys, in my opinion, and based on most people's opinion, on Israel only on Facebook. This is where I learned about Jason Staples and how they understand him. Here's a highly esteemed scholar, Biera says. Jason A. Staples of the University of North Carolina published paper on Romans 11. He proves that the wild olive tree in Romans 11 is dispersed Israelites that have intermarried with Gentiles. Catch that real quick. He proves that the wild olive tree in Romans 11 is dispersed. Now, if Io's suggesting based on Jason Staples' work, they're interpreting that this is their explanation of how his work does, that's not what they're saying here. So I think the correction needed to be made that this isn't what Jason Staples is actually teaching. He believes that it is buying into the narrative of the regathering concept being fulfilled through a spiritualization, a resurrection of actual Gentiles, not Israelites, Gentiles who are becoming children of Abraham by faith. That's what Jason Staples is suggesting. And please don't lump me in with Jason Staples, because this is what he is saying. I'm correcting the, if you will, the persona that is put on him. This is why engagement with this scholar is necessary. This is the article that I keep saying everyone needs to read. It's important to read so you understand Staples' position. Take your time when you read it very carefully and understand what he's trying to suggest. He does not believe Israelites exist in the first century. With that being said, this might be where it all started in terms of this assumption. So when I saw that, I was like, wow, an esteemed scholar did agree with IO? Holy moly, I emailed Jason Staples. And wouldn't you know it, Jason Staples responded. And we've had a dialogue back and forth. He's a busy man. He's not only a coach for football, but also he is a professor. And he was a student of Dr. Ehrman. And so he has responded back to me about doing a show once he publishes his 2 books. And he's not far from me, too. I'd hope to get to him in person so we could do really good in-close, high-definition interviews on his theory and his books that will be coming out on this very subject. This article is just hitting the surface, scratching the surface. I suspect his book is going to get more in-depth and it's going to be more source material explaining why he thinks the way he does. Because peer-reviewed scholars, I'm sure they checked it out and started challenging, so his book is going to be kind of in that vein. DaCosta made a big deal about this inclusion of a question mark at the end of the title. And Israel only question mark? Scholar? But if you go to the 5-minute and 20-second mark of that video, he doesn't actually phrase this as a question. This is verbatim what he said.
So he's not the first scholar, but he is, in my opinion, one of the more complete IO type scholars that I've come across in terms of that particular passage specifically, where they understand that what Paul is doing there is he's answering, or he's explaining how all Israel would be saved. And he's saying that it would include the ingathering of the lost tribes, of the 10 northern tribes who are out in the nations. And so
I don't want to belabor the point here, but when DaCosta made that statement, he was under the wrong impression that Staples believed that there were, in fact, actual lost Israelites out in the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. And as I've pointed out, Staples flat out rejects this idea. He claims that the northern Israelites ceased to be their own separate ethnic group way back in the 8th century BC, and that there's no evidence for Josephus' claim that there were 10 distinct Israelite tribes across the Euphrates somewhere. Yet DaCosta still claims that Staples used historical facts to prove that the Israelites were out in the nations. He did the work. He cited the examples, Jason says. Listen to this on his video.
he used historical facts to prove that the Israelites were out in the nations. He cited Josephus. He cited the Maccabees, I believe. He cited the books in the New Testament that actually refer to the 12 tribes and, not just the 2 southern tribes, but the 12 tribes scattered abroad. He did the work. He cited the examples. I'm not the best with that. Like I said, I'm just a guy who drives around crushing cars in his Dodge Ram pickup truck. I basically should have a mullet and a shotgun in the back seat, for crying out loud. I'm not that guy, okay? I don't go through the exhaustive lengths of finding the who said this, or the when it was, or the what page, or the what, right? I'm the quick skim surface guy. All right, I got it. Boom, let's roll with it.
It seems like what DaCosta is insinuating is that the historical evidence that Staples considers to be
unreliable
for reconstructing what actually happened in history is actually
very reliable.
In fact, DaCosta thinks that it's proof that actual northern Israelites were all over the Roman Empire. So again, I'm just trying to set the record straight. DaCosta has a different interpretation of the sources, I guess. But Staples is not using these sources to prove anything that comes close to I.O. So what Jason Staples is saying is that they're not there, but by these very arguments that are being utilized, DaCosta is saying they are there. DaCosta claims that Staples' theory entails that there was a, quote, interracial mixing of Abraham's seed of the Israelites out in the nations that then would save the nations, all mixed together. So it was this big mixed bag, a mixed bag of nuts, so to speak, end quote. Check out the video yourself.
He believes that it was more of a interracial mixing of Abraham's seed of the Israelites out in the nations that then would save the nations all mixed together. So it was this big mixed bag, right?
He goes on to describe the process of mixing and blending and breeding and jungle dancing. But again, I'd like to clarify that this whole idea of the mixing of Abraham's seed with the nations, according to Staples, is supposed to have taken place in history in the 8th century BC. Staples likens this to ethnic cleansing that he claims took place within a few generations. By the time you get to the 1st century AD, these events are in the distant past. The Israelites are long gone. So the Christian Gentiles that Paul was dealing with were not actually mixed Israelites, according to Staples. They were resurrected Israelites by faith in Christ in some supernatural, theological sense. I'm not saying that this is actually true. I'm clarifying this is what Jason Staples is claiming. Now, I understand why this doesn't fit into the I.O. paradigm, so I know why DaCosta rejects it. But this is where I really struggled to follow, because he's adamant that the Bible is a supernatural tale about the implausible regathering of lost Israelites from 7 centuries prior. Yet he seems to cling to the idea that these lost Israelites really existed in the 1st century. He needs this to be a reflection of historical reality. Listen to him in the video here.
A logical option. Does this sound like God is going to preserve his people? And it doesn't matter what how that's possible, right? You're not supposed to think about that. But God's going to preserve his people and bring them back, plain and simple.
It's just a story, right? A story that's not concerned with how plausible this idea seems. It's symbolic imagery. It's La La Land fairy tale. It's hopeful expectations. It's wackadoodle. DaCosta makes a point later on to distinguish between what seems to be the case in history and what the text allegedly says. So he appears to acknowledge that these two things are separate and that they may actually be in conflict. DaCosta clearly states that it doesn't matter if the survival of the northern Israelites was possible. He says, you're not supposed to think about that. The story's not concerned with plausibility. So it seems like I.O. is left explaining, or having to explain, why exactly these apparent references to the 12 tribes must be taken literally and accepted as historical evidence for actual Israelites existing in these early church communities. DaCosta makes a case for why he thinks that literal interpretations trump non-literal interpretations. But it's not clear why this should be the default explanation if actual history doesn't support it. I'm just asking questions here. I'm not pretending like I have all the answers. These are issues that I.O. doesn't seem to grapple with as far as I can tell. What if Paul was conscripting actual Gentiles and simply believes that they were literal descendants of Jacob? Why is this not within the realm of possibility for DaCosta? We know verisimilitude, a lot of times in fictional writings, the authors will write things that are relevant to the audience who's listening. The audience listening, if there were no historical Israelites, as historians would claim, according to this view Jason Staples is putting, couldn't they have done something like this? Now for another argumentation here, so to speak, that is presented by Jason DaCosta. Is Jason Staples a Bible-believing wannabe Israelite futurist Christian who thinks all Israel is yet not saved? Yes, I did inform Jason that as far as I know, Dr. Staples is a Christian. DaCosta confirms that this was obvious just reading the article itself, which really you need to read the article yourself to find out. So I'm not sure why it even matters that I was the one who informed him about this. According to DaCosta, the main instance of Dr. Staples' Christian bias in the article itself is that he thinks he's an Israelite. I'm sorry, but the article definitely does not say that at all. I said that someone needs to point out exactly where his biases are obviously incorporated into his work. I mean, you really want to show it if you're going to make these claims. Where exactly is he driving a theologically driven agenda? To that point, I do have a response from Dr. Staples that I'd like to read. A buddy of mine asked him some pointed questions in Ehrman's blog, specifically to get answers on the topic of both full preterism and Christian bias. I'll read the questions first, followed by Staples' response. And by the way, he's still answering on Ehrman's blog. I'm hoping to see engagement from Israel only. Quote, if we grant that all the New Testament authors believed the end was coming within their lifetime, how can this be reconciled with a universalist interpretation that the gospel had to be literally preached to all Gentiles before the end? Full preterists believe that the end anticipated in the New Testament was AD 70, citing a number of proof texts indicating the gospel had already gone out and been revealed to all nations. Check out the references. 1 Thessalonians 1:8, Romans 1:8, Romans 9:17, quoting Exodus 9:16, Romans 10:18, quoting Psalms 19:4, Romans 16:26, 2 Timothy 4:17, Colossians 1:5-6, Colossians 1:23. This supposedly refutes futurist doctrines about the legitimacy of spreading the gospel beyond AD 70. Certain critics of your work, who believe that Paul thought all of the elect were literal descendants of Jacob, allege that you're a Bible-believing futurist Christian, and that this bias ostensibly prevents you from evaluating the Bible objectively. Would you be willing to respond to the charge that your religious beliefs color your interpretations? Namely, that you believe the mission to regather the lost tribes of Israel is ongoing to the present day, and that as a Christian, you necessarily believe yourself to be an Israelite through faith in Christ. End quote. Here is Jason Staples' response. Quote, first of all, I don't grant that Paul and the other New Testament authors believed that the end was coming within their lifetimes. They may have, and some probably did. But I don't think there's enough evidence to conclude that they did, and I'm skeptical that that conclusion, given the traditions of a lengthier time of the Messiah and other similar ideas that appear in early Judaism and later rabbinic texts, not to mention some of the New Testament books themselves. And even if some or all of these figures expected the end of the age in their own generation, it's also important to distinguish what the end of the age means. It's not the end of the world in the American evangelical or Hollywood movie sense, but rather the beginning of a new era of justice associated with Israel's restoration, presumably mediated by the Messiah's rule. In that respect, one could argue that the author of Acts believed this new age had already begun, with Jesus ruling as the heavenly Messiah. But Luke, like Paul, still seems to expect Jesus to return from heaven at the beginning of another age. So we might actually be dealing with multiple ages. Note, Paul's plural ends of the ages in 1 Corinthians 10:11. In any case, regardless of these full preterist proof texting efforts, Paul certainly did not believe that the gospel had already been proclaimed to all nations. The end of Romans makes that clear enough. He's still hoping to get beyond Rome to new territory where the gospel has not yet been preached. That said, I also don't think Paul is a universalist, though he seems to hold hopes for something approximating universalism. As for the charge of religious beliefs coloring our conclusions, that sword cuts in all directions. No one, including anyone lobbying such criticism around, occupies objective territory from which to evaluate things. All we can do is account for our own bias and do the best we can to approximate objectivity. As for the idea that spreading the gospel after 70 AD is somehow illegitimate, or would have been thought illegitimate by Paul or other New Testament authors, it seems difficult to square that idea with the fact that most of the New Testament books, including Gospels, were written after 70 AD. End quote. Before anyone attacks me over what I just read, let me just remind everyone that these are not my own ideas or opinions. I'm not endorsing or agreeing with these views, so if you don't like what Dr. Staples said, take it up with him yourself on Ehrman's blog. In 200 words or less, don't shoot the messenger. I encourage you to engage. Note that he didn't deny being a Christian. It is interesting. But he is open to the idea that the New Testament authors may have held conflicting beliefs. So I'm not sure how that fits into DaCosta's assumptions about his belief in the reliability of the Bible in some supernatural sense. And Staples doesn't think Paul was an absolute universalist, contrary to DaCosta's assertion that Staples believes anyone can come. It seems like what Staples personally believes may not necessarily coincide with what he thinks Paul may have believed, but I could be wrong. Another argument here. What's wrong with referring to actual Israelites as biological Israelites? DaCosta called me out for using the word biological when I was quoting him, and I admit that I used this word in a paraphrase of what I understood to be DaCosta's view. So I may have been wrong about this, but I certainly hear that word thrown around in other IO forums. Note that when I used that term in my discussion with James Stevens Valiant, saying that IO is all about the biological genetic kinship, DaCosta made a response video where he confirmed that my description was, of course, the most important part of IO. See the video yourself. From Genesis to Revelation, all it's about is the biological genetic kinship relationship of Abraham and his seed.
Well, not all that it's about. That's, of course, the most important part. But
in fact, he clarified his position on this in an episode last year. Listen to it yourself.
But this guy was trying to make the argument that I say that it was only literal bloodline descendants of Israel that were saved. All right. And for those of you who know me and who have followed me, you know that I've always maintained that I'm still 50-50 on it. I still am kind of torn on whether it was bloodline or whether it was just covenant only, because this is what people forget. If a foreigner joined Israel, okay, they literally became Israel in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, okay? It didn't matter where they were from. If they joined Israel and they were circumcised, they became Israel. Okay, so I think people forget that. They think of these people as, still true foreigners, yet the foreigner actually became as native born. Okay, and I'll read a passage from Ezekiel 47 to you.
He even expressed something similar to this on my show, that he's open-minded about the Old Testament passages describing the inclusion of non-Israelite foreigners into the Old Covenant through ritual circumcision. I've never encountered any other IOer who is open to this possibility, but I respect Jason DaCosta for resisting what may be some kind of groupthink on this point. So I'm happy to fall back on a term that DaCosta does use, actual Northern Tribe Israelites. But I honestly don't know what the difference is if we're talking about the Gentiles in the New Testament being actual Israelites. Around the 1 hour and 15-minute mark, DaCosta asserts that there's no way you could get any true Israelites out of a mixing of the Israelites with the nations. And that seems like a reasonable assumption if true Israelites means biological descendants of the northern tribes. Another argument. Was Paul's use of the term for Gentile an innovation? Soon after I posted my video, I realized that I made a mistake and added a correction in the comments. At 14 minutes and 10 seconds, I misquoted Dr. Staples, where he means to say he isn't sure he's completely agreeing with these scholars. Listen to the clip yourself. Their hypothesis, which I'm sure I fully agree with, is that Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals is in fact an innovation. The scholars I'm referring to have names that are hard to pronounce, and I kind of butchered them in the last video. One of them is Dr. Ophir. The other is Dr. Rosenzweig. Here's what Dr. Staples says about them. Quote, I suggest taking a look at Ophir and Rosenzweig's 2008 book, Goy, which engages in a highly detailed and quite technical, theoretical, at times, history of the term. Their hypothesis, which I'm not sure I fully agree with, is that Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals is in fact an innovation. End quote. So to clarify, Dr. Staples is not sure whether he fully agrees with the hypothesis that Paul's use of the term ethne as a reference to Gentiles is an innovation. I accidentally misread that part, saying that he is sure that he agrees with the hypothesis, but he doesn't. This ended up being misleading, and DaCosta totally ran with the wrong assumption, so I'm just fixing that mistake for the record on my own error there. I did pin a comment below the video, so anyone watching the video that I had can see that I corrected my issue in the comment section. When I had made this mistake 2 weeks ago, I did put a pinned comment at the very top 2 weeks ago from the time I'm recording here. At 14 minutes, 10 seconds, I misquoted Dr. Staples when he means to say he isn't sure he completely agree with these scholars. And of course, he goes into his reasoning. But again, I think he's missing the point and overestimating the extent to which Dr. Staples supports I.O. DaCosta says this.
Valuable insight. When Derek accused me of victory flagging this, I don't know what he said. But I did say that a lot of this guy's information backs up I.O. Like, for instance, what Derek's about to read to you here. Somebody asked this guy, Jason Staples, what the word Gentile is, and you just heard him say that it's pretty much a made-up word that came a long time after, and that it actually, the real word, means just nations. And what I want you guys to pick up is in Dr. Staples' answer, notice how he says that the term could be used to speak of individuals and nations, people living in nations, right? I want you to pay attention to that, because that's very important. Because if that is the case, and of course it is, then that means that when it said that many of these Gentiles are coming in, all that's being said there is people from the nations are coming in. People from the nations, right? It's not as specific. It's not as specific, oh, that's a Gentile, that's a pagan, that's nobody connected to Israel. No, it just meant somebody living outside of the confines of Judaism, living outside in the nations. Ready? Check it out.
In the Hebrew Bible, the nations are the various people groups across the earth, of which Israel is the one specifically chosen to be Yahweh's covenant people.
Interesting how he notes that.
On occasion, the nations is used as shorthand to refer to the nations other than Israel. This latter use of the term becomes more common in the literature of late Second Temple period, and in the New Testament, the nations almost always refers to everyone else. Paul uses the collective noun nations or nation to refer both to non-Jewish groups and to individuals within those people groups, akin to using America to
individuals within those people groups. Notice how he said non-Jewish groups. I like that. Finally, somebody used it right. Okay, you get all these people that conflate the two terms, Jew and Israel. Okay, but it seems like he knows how to use that term in the first century, because let's not forget that the Jews were referred to as Israel. It's very, very tricky because the Jewish nation was referred to as Israel.
This was the moment where I accidentally misquote Staples, and DaCosta hones in on my mistake, thinking that it was the accurate quote. He says this.
Exist. Paul's use of the term to refer to individuals as like, he's a Gentile. No, that doesn't exist. Paul was an apostle to the nations, not the Gentiles. And he was an apostle to the nations for the purpose of gathering in the elect.
Now, I think that it's really important to point out the ramifications of my slip-up and DaCosta's misinterpretation that results from this. Around the 1 hour and 9 minute mark, when Staples refers to actual Gentiles being incorporated in the church, DaCosta's confusion is palpable when he says this.
Gentiles was an innovation and that it really isn't a term. He said much of Israel has become Gentiles, right? But all that means is much of Israel was living in the nations. That's all that means, right? Do you see that? I hope you see that. On one hand, they say that Israel was going to become Gentile. But on the other hand, he says that Gentile's not really a word and it should just mean nation. So all that it really means is that Israel was existing in the nations. That's it.
No, Staples is not saying that it's an innovation, nor is he saying that ethne isn't really a term. That was my mistake. I misquoted him. Sorry. Dr. Staples is explaining that the use of the term the nations to refer to nations other than Israel becomes more common in the literature of the Second Temple period and in the New Testament. That means other nations. He says that the nations almost always refers to everyone else. He says that Paul uses the collective noun nation, nations to refer to non-Jewish groups and to individuals within those people groups, a use that we also find in later rabbinic literature. So when DaCosta refers to people who conflate the two terms Jew and Israel, he takes for granted that Staples is not conflating these terms. But as far as I can tell, this is exactly what Dr. Staples is doing. He's clearly indicating that the nations is used in the New Testament to refer to nations other than Israel. When he says non-Jewish in that context, he actually means non-Israelite, because he does not believe that the northern tribes were in the picture at that point. This is consistent with his explanation as to why Josephus switches to using the term Jew exclusively. As far as I can tell, when Staples describes the concept of the all 12 tribes being, he means it is in some kind of symbolic, eschatological, or theological sense that they exist. He doesn't take it literally the way Io does. Since Staples doesn't provide a very detailed explanation of the terminology for Jew and Gentile as he understands it, to illustrate this further, I'll read some key excerpts from the paper that Staples is referring to by Ophir and Rosenzweig, which I'll link below, along with a presentation based on this article by a Hebrew scholar named Christine Hayes. There's a lot of interesting information there, which people should definitely check out if they're interested in this topic. I'm going to try to get Dr. Hayes on this show sometime soon. So hopefully we can get into this in more detail. So before I read anything, here's a disclaimer. I'm about to read several quotations from various sections of the article Paul and the Invention of the Gentiles, published in the Jewish Quarterly Review in 2015 by Dr. Ophir and Dr. Rosenzweig. By reading this quotation, I am in no way endorsing the opinions of the authors. I'm simply citing this article because Jason Staples defers to it as being an authoritative source for a detailed explanation of how the term nations was used in the late Second Temple period. I paraphrased some of the more technical sections to the best of my ability. I'm really just skimming the surface here to give you a gist. So if you want to read the full version, which I highly recommend, I'll post the link below. Quote, the scholarly consensus is that Paul uses a binary distinction between Jews and ethne that he borrowed from Jewish tradition. We claim that no such tradition of a binary distinction between Jews and ethne existed, despite scattered cases where goy is used to refer to indefinite groups of non-Jewish individuals. We claim that Paul's ethne precedes the rabbinic use of the term goy. The rabbinic goy assumes a dualistic conception of a social reality in which Jews are juxtaposed with everyone else, and each member of this everyone else is a Gentile in the same sense to the same extent. In the Hebrew Bible, goy simply means nation, with Israel too being a goy, a holy goy. Indeed, but still a nation among nations. The election of Israel and its separation from the nations did not create a united category for the nations, let alone individual persons from which Israel has been separated. During the Hellenistic period, however, a semantic differentiation takes place, and goyim begins to be used mostly for foreign nations. A well-known development in the meaning of the word was introduced by the Greek Septuagint, translation of the Hebrew Bible, which systematically distinguished between ethne, which consistently refers to foreign nations, and laos, which denotes Israel alone. Paul makes extensive use of the ethne in his letters, mainly in Romans and Galatians. He mentions the term 45 times, far more than any other collective designation. When biblical verses on goyim are cited or paraphrased, they are also applied by Paul to his own congregations. Other occurrences also make sense only if referring to groups of individuals. In fact, only very few cases can be reasonably read as referring to nations, exclusively according to the Old Testament or Old Biblical sense of the term. He took a marginal use, radicalized it, and made it into a core of his thought. He was, in other words, the first author we know of to systematically capitalize on the possibilities that the shift of the meaning of ethne opens. It is this specific move that is not to be found in Qumran, in the books of Maccabees, or in the best of our knowledge, in any other pre-Pauline composition. Our claim is that Paul's letters are the textual site for the first known appearance of a new concept in Jewish discourse in which a generalized, individualized category of Gentiles, still pronounced in the plural, ethne, served as a key element for the whole conceptual constellation. End quote. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion, but Dr. Staples deferred to this source with the caveat that he does not entirely agree with the conclusion that Paul's use of the term ethne is in fact an innovation. Presumably he assumes this usage actually predates Paul, but he doesn't give any details on this. He simply recommends that people read the book. I think Staples' skepticism is probably along the lines of Dr. Christine Hayes' rejection of this theory, which she explains around the 5-minute mark of a video that I will link below. You're going to see it in a minute. It's a fascinating presentation that highlights a common kind of interaction between scholars, where someone can use a source they find agreeable in certain instances while disagreeing on specific points of contention. I think this is how IOers might be able to interact with Dr. Staples' view as long as they properly understand it. Check out the video.
Ophir and Rosenzweig build their argument on changes in the meaning of the word goy. This is their research method is really to focus on this word and how it changes. The rabbis, they note, are the first to use the term in its grammatical singular form, goy, as a reference to a single non-Jewish individual, a goy, of fixed character, they argue. Biblically, the term goy doesn't mean this. It means nation, usually a foreign nation, but Israel, too, is a goy in the Bible. The shift from the biblical goy, meaning a nation among many national groups, or goyim, to the rabbinic goy, meaning an individual non-Jew who is the polar opposite of the Jew, created a strict binary in the rabbinic period. One was either a Jew or a goy, no hybrid identities, and this led the rabbis to create conversion, a very clear process that just picked you up and moved you from one side of the binary to the other, no hybrid identity. And I hope I've represented them fairly. If one is interested in tracing the history of the term goy, then the conclusion that the rabbis used the term goy in a manner that's unattested in earlier literature is perfectly correct. However, as a history of the concept of an undifferentiated and generalized other, I'm not entirely persuaded by the argument. In order to elucidate a text's concept of the non-Jew, we can't confine ourselves to a single term. Rather, we must ask more broadly whether the text treats non-Jews as a single, static, universalized, undifferentiated class, regardless of the terminology that's employed. And even when multiple ethnic or religious subgroups might be labeled, are they still all being picked out and treated as one group? Or does the text treat different non-Jews in different ways based on a recognition of their internal ethnic or religious diversity? Well, when the rhetorical treatment of the non-Jew, rather than the specific term, is placed front and center, we find that the two concepts of the other that are so helpfully outlined by Ophir and Rosenzweig, I think they do us a great service by giving us these categories to think with. We find these two types of other function at one and the same time to define and redefine Jew and other. Like other human groups, ancient Jews held a macro-level concept of the other when establishing the boundaries of their own community and defining themselves. And these static macro-level constructions were continually destabilized by micro-level constructions that often represent direct encounters, whether real or imagined again, with particular individuals, often in narrative form. And this adds an element of dynamism to the maintenance of community boundaries. Rather than adopting the diachronic approach of Ophir and Rosenzweig, I propose then a synchronic approach, according to which both biblical and rabbinic literature contain both macro-level concepts of an undifferentiated and generalized other, even when the term goy is not employed. And I also show, I'm sorry, I've sort of messed up that sentence, so I will pretend I didn't. I will show that this happens in both biblical and rabbinic literature, right? You have this undifferentiated macro-level concept of the other, and you also have that being destabilized by micro-level constructions of particularized individual others. Certainly, Rosenzweig and Ophir are correct when they say that there are important differences between the biblical and rabbinic sources. Absolutely. The rabbis are more extreme, perhaps, in their representation of the static, undifferentiated goy. There are differences in emphasis, there are differences, but they are differences in degree, I think, rather than differences in kind.
And that brings me to the last issue posted by DaCosta that I'd like to examine. Am I guilty of fine-tooth combing details that don't need to be fine-tooth combed? At the 1 hour and 15 minute mark, see for yourself,
Do you see the consistency? So what I need you to ask yourself right now is Derek being consistent with the story? Are they being consistent? Because remember, they would tell you that there's no way. They would have to be mixed. They would have to be intermarried and intermixed and breeded with other nations. And there's no way that you could get any true Israelites out of that scenario. But what did I just read you? I read you promises from the Old Testament that say that Israel was going to be in the nations, in the countries, and then he would finally, at some point, gather them from all these countries. Now, does it seem like God, through that Old Testament prophet, had the same concerns that Derek does?
DaCosta asks, rhetorically, is Derek being consistent with the story? Then he rephrases the question, are they being consistent? But of course, what he really means is Jason Staples being consistent with the story? But he just can't help lumping us together. And he asks whether God, through Ezekiel, had the same concerns that Derek does about the fact that the Israelites had mixed with the nation 700 years prior. He quotes or says, clearly the biblical authors didn't use the same fine-tooth comb that Derek does, end quote. Again, conflating my opinion with Jason Staples. But here's the thing. It doesn't take a PhD to recognize that Old Testament authors were writing who knows how many centuries prior to the first century. So I'm not sure what value the Old Testament has for making judgments about what was happening on the ground in the first century in history. Honestly, I don't think anyone is looking at the biblical narrative with all of its supernatural prophecy of the regathering of Israel with a fine-tooth comb here. At least for me personally, that's not how I evaluate biblical narratives or Paul's theology or eschatology. This really boils down to a historical claim that there were actual northern Israelites scattered all over the Roman Empire who were somehow distinct from the other Hellenized diaspora Jews. I'm not declaring that this was definitely not the case. It just seems odd to me that ancient historians apparently never took notice of this. At the 51-minute mark, DaCosta accuses me of trying to skew and shrink down the power of the Josephus quote.
He's going to try to skew and shrink down its power, right?
I'm not sure how that is, since I cited a translation of the entire quote verbatim. I was simply trying to demonstrate what Josephus actually wrote, that there were only 2 tribes residing in Europe and Asia, which is exactly where he himself resided. I very frequently encounter Iowers leaving that part of the passage out. If the other 10 tribes were also in that region, in the West, why didn't Josephus mention that? So again, I'm not using Josephus to refute Io. I'm just clarifying what the text actually says. Let's just get these facts straight and see where they lead us. DaCosta even mentions that people today believe there are 10 lost tribes out there, and the black Hebrew Israelites think that they're the 12 tribes.
Pre-70, if it was written in 200 AD, whoever wrote this story clearly knew the 12 tribes were out in the nations. Or at the very least, that was their tradition. That was what they were told. That was what they hoped would happen. Plain and simple. Let's continue to see Derek try to argue that the 10 tribes were not out in the nations. You know what's funny is people today still think that the 12 tribes are going to come back, right? There's groups out there that actually believe in this crap, that the 12 tribes are going to come back, that they're being preserved, right? Look at the black Hebrew Israelites. Those idiots think that they're the 12 tribes.
Now just let that sink in for a second. How was the first century any different from today in that respect? It was 7 centuries after the Assyrian exile. Look at this chart, look at this image to show you a graph of the distance and genealogies, the generations. It's like the time span between now and the 1300s AD, yet people seemingly believe that there were still lost Israelites out in the nations, regardless of whether or not they actually existed. It's a tradition. It's a myth. It's a legend. What they hoped for, imagined, dreamed of, it's wackadoodle, as DaCosta likes to say. Why can't we just embrace that and lower our confidence in the historical argument if it's not supported by the evidence? So in closing, I'm just going to have to punt this historical question to professional historian Dr. Richard Carrier. I certainly hope that he does go through the historical sources with a fine-tooth comb, because that's what a good historian does. Let's see what he comes up with. Maybe he'll uncover something interesting. Look, I'm not qualified to delve into the primary and secondary sources for all of this stuff. That's what professionals do. DaCosta is so insistent that he's not impressed by people with doctor in front of their name. He says he deals with medical doctors all the time. He's adamant that this doesn't impress him at all. But let's face it, I think he'd approach this quite differently, for example, if he had to trust someone to perform some important surgery on him or a loved one, right? I assume that he'd want an actual specialist to handle that, and that specialist would be a doctor. So I don't think there's anything wrong with deferring to specialists in the field of history to answer specific historical questions, and for specialists in the field of biblical studies to answer specific biblical questions. Of course, we lay people can always roll up our sleeves and question what these experts bring to the table. Certainly, experts get things wrong, and they very often can't agree amongst themselves. This is certainly the case with biblical scholarship, and Pauline studies in particular. But I think it's important to take the time to understand exactly what these scholars are saying before we draw our own conclusions. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching this continue to be a fascinating discussion. And Jason DaCosta is a very friendly guy. You know, I love the engagement. It gets a little tough here at times, but that's to be expected, especially when you have differing views. So, like I said, thanks for staying tuned this long. I hope you're interested in this discussion as much as I am and presenting these theories and letting you guys challenge your thinking, because who knows, we might both be wrong.